I never expected that one rainy afternoon would change my entire life forever. I never expected that helping a lonely old man find shelter from a storm would lead to lawyers knocking on the convent door months later, telling me a nun who owned nothing but her faith and her rosary that I had inherited a billionaire's entire fortune. I remember standing in that hallway, still wearing my habit, still smelling like the soup kitchen where I'd spent my morning, and thinking this had to be some kind of mistake. But it wasn't a mistake. And by the end of this story, you will understand why the greatest gift I ever received was never the money itself. To understand why my name appeared in that impossible will, you have to understand who I was before any of this happened. My name is Sister Catherine. I have lived inside the walls of St. Agnes Convent in upstate New York for nearly 22 years. My life was quiet, beautifully quiet. Every morning I rose before the sun, said my prayers, helped prepare breakfast for the women at our shelter, and spent my afternoons either working in the soup kitchen downtown or visiting elderly residents at the local care home. I owned almost nothing. I wanted almost nothing. My vows meant everything to me: poverty, chastity, obedience. I didn't take those vows because someone forced me. I took them because I genuinely believed that a life poured out for others was the richest life a person could ever live. I believed then, and I still believe now, that every single act of kindness matters, even the ones no one ever sees. It was a Thursday afternoon in late October. The sky had turned that particular shade of gray that means rain is coming fast, and it means it. I was walking back from the pharmacy, carrying medication for one of our older sisters, when the storm hit without warning. I ducked under the awning of a small cafe on Mercer Street, and that's when I first saw him. An old man, sitting alone on a wooden bench outside, completely exposed to the rain, not moving, not calling for help. Just sitting there with his hands folded in his lap like he had nowhere to be and no one waiting for him. I watched for a moment. Other people rushed past him. A young couple laughed under their shared umbrella and didn't glance his way. A businessman actually stepped around the bench without a word. And something in my chest simply would not let me keep walking. I went to him. I asked if he was all right. He looked up at me with these pale gray eyes that carried a kind of tiredness I recognized immediately, not physical tiredness, but the deep exhaustion of a person who has been lonely for a very long time. He said he was fine. I didn't believe him. I sat down beside him on that wet bench and offered him the small umbrella I was carrying. He tried to refuse it. I told him it was either both of us staying dry or neither of us, and he let out this low, surprised laugh that seemed to catch even him off guard. I walked him inside the cafe and bought him a cup of coffee. He told me his name was Edward. Just Edward. He didn't offer a last name, and I didn't ask for one. We talked for almost 2 hours that afternoon. I say talked, but honestly, Edward mostly listened, and I mostly asked questions. He seemed genuinely startled that someone was interested in what he thought, what he remembered, what he felt. He told me he had grown up poor, that he had made his life through work and sacrifice, that he had a son somewhere who didn't return his calls anymore. He said it casually, the way people say things they've practiced saying without emotion so it doesn't hurt as much. But I saw his hands tighten around that coffee cup when he said it. I noticed. I always notice those things. Before I left, I told him that St. Agnes ran a free lunch every Friday and that he was welcome any time. He smiled politely in the way people smile when they assume an invitation is just courtesy. I meant every word. He came the following Friday, and the Friday after that, and then every single Friday for the next 4 months. He would arrive exactly at noon, sit at the same corner table near the window, and we would talk while I worked. He was extraordinarily well-read. He spoke about economics, about history, about philosophy, with the casual depth of a man who had spent decades thinking seriously about serious things. But he never talked about his own life in concrete terms. No company names, no addresses. Occasionally a sleek black car would drop him off and wait outside, which I noticed but never pressed him about. Once, a man in an expensive suit appeared at the door looking for him, and Edward's expression shifted into something controlled and deliberate before he excused himself. When he came back, he changed the subject immediately. I let him. What I remember most was not the mystery of who he might be. What I remember most was the afternoon he told me, very quietly, that no one had sat with him at a meal in over 3 years. 3 years. He had assistants and employees and lawyers and a house with more rooms than he could count. And not one person had simply sat beside him at a table in 3 years. I didn't say anything profound in response. I just refilled his coffee and sat back down. But something in his eyes changed that afternoon. Something unlocked, and I didn't fully understand until much later what that moment had meant to him. The turning point came in February. I remember because the ground was still frozen hard and the shelter was at full capacity. Edward arrived on a Friday afternoon looking pale and unsteady on his feet. I could see immediately that he was ill. He brushed off my concern the way proud men do, insisting it was nothing. But when he stood to leave, his knees buckled. I caught him. He was embarrassed deeply, almost painfully embarrassed, and I could see he was fighting the humiliation of needing help. I told him it was all right. I called our convent's small medical volunteer, got him a warm room to rest in for the afternoon, sat beside him while he slept, and prayed quietly in the corner. When he woke up, he found me still there. He stared at me for a long moment, and then he said something I have never forgotten. He said, "You didn't have to stay." And I told him, yes, I did. That was the truth. I wasn't performing kindness that day. I simply could not have left him there alone. It was not something I decided. It was something I was. I did not see Edward again after that. He called once, a brief conversation where he thanked me warmly and said his health required him to travel for treatment. He sounded different on the phone, quieter, more settled, like a man who had resolved something within himself. I prayed for him every morning after that and told myself that whatever time he had left, I hoped he spent it with people who loved him. I never once imagined that he was spending that time thinking about me. 7 months later, on a warm September Tuesday, there was a knock at the convent door. 2 lawyers in dark suits. They asked for Sister Catherine by name. My first thought was that I had done something wrong. My second thought was that someone I loved had died. It turned out both of those instincts were partially true, just not in the ways I expected. Edward, whose full name I finally learned that morning, had passed away 3 weeks earlier. Edward Harlan Whitfield, one of the wealthiest men in the northeastern United States. Real estate, private equity, a portfolio that the lawyers described in numbers I could not make my mind hold on to. And in his final will, executed just 4 months before his death, he had left the entirety of his personal estate, over $900 million, to me. I laughed. I genuinely laughed, the startled, disbelieving kind of laugh that comes before the shock arrives. Then I sat down on the floor of the hallway because my legs stopped working. The lawyers explained that Edward had left detailed letters explaining his decision. He had written that I was the only person in the final years of his life who had treated him not as a transaction, not as a resource, not as a legacy, but as a human being who deserved to be seen. He wrote that the afternoon I stayed beside him while he slept was the moment he understood what he had spent his entire life failing to build genuine human connection. He wrote that he trusted me with his fortune because I was the only person he had ever met who clearly did not want it. What followed was chaos. His son contested the will immediately and publicly. A major newspaper ran a headline I would rather not repeat. His former business partners hired their own lawyers and began making claims. People I had never met in my life called the convent to tell me what they thought I should do with money I had not yet decided to accept. The media camped outside our gate for 2 weeks. I barely slept. I prayed constantly. I talked to my mother superior, who told me something that cut straight to the center of everything. She said, "Catherine, the question isn't whether you deserve this. The question is what this was given to do." That question carried me through every sleepless night. I pored over Edward's letters. He had not written instructions. He had written something more difficult: trust. He trusted me to know what mattered. And gradually, through prayer and tears and long conversations and the occasional burst of genuine fear, I began to understand what I was supposed to do. I did not keep the fortune for myself. I accepted it legally after working with an independent ethics board and the church. And then I began the work of turning it into something that would outlast both Edward and me, a network of fully funded shelters for elderly men and women experiencing homelessness, a foundation supporting long-term care for isolated seniors, a program that places volunteers in care facilities specifically to ensure that no elderly person spends 3 years without someone sitting beside them at a meal. I named it the Friday Table. Edward would have found that sentimental. He would have loved it anyway. The legal battles eventually settled. The headlines faded. The cameras went away. And I returned to the quiet that I had always loved. Except now, the quiet held a different kind of weight, the weight of something that matters, something permanent, something that will keep moving in the world long after I am gone. Edward gave me money, but what he truly gave me was the evidence that a single act of ordinary human kindness can rewrite an entire legacy. I sat beside him on a wet bench because I could not have done otherwise. And he sat with that memory for the remaining years of his life and decided it was the most valuable thing anyone had ever given him. Not a contract, not a return on investment, just a woman who refused to walk past a lonely old man in the rain. I think about that bench almost every day. I think about every person sitting somewhere right now waiting for someone to notice them. And I think about how terrifyingly easy it is to keep walking. Please don't keep walking. Now, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it honestly. If you had inherited that fortune, if those lawyers had knocked on your door, what would you have done with it? Tell me in the comments below because I genuinely want to know. And if this story reminded you that kindness still exists in this world, that it still matters, that it can still change everything, please share it. Share it with someone who needs to believe that today, because stories like Edward's and mine don't need to stay between us. They need to travel, just like kindness does.